Millionaire abandons his deaf and mute son. 25 years later he buys the entire company his father.
Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
Alexander, a millionaire, was a cold, ambitious, and ruthless man. When his wife died during childbirth, Alexander blamed the baby Peter, who was born deaf and mute. In his anger and grief, Alexander refused to take responsibility as a father. He decided to place Peter in an orphanage, concealing the truth about his son from those around him to protect his personal image. The haunting image of Alexander turning his back and leaving Peter at the orphanage remained vivid, Peter reaching out as if begging him to stay. The orphanage staff condemned his actions, but Alexander only cast them a cold gaze before driving away, leaving Peter in tears. Alexander even justified his decision by claiming that a mute child would never amount to anything in life and that he didn't need such a burden. Mrs. Rose, a caretaker at the orphanage, could not hide the anger in her eyes. "Alexander, your son is not a burden. He is a precious child who deserves to be loved. You cannot be so heartless." Alexander pulled his hand away from Peter's and turned to face Mrs. Rose. "I'm not here for a lecture. I've made my decision. You just need to do your job," he said firmly before walking away. Mrs. Rose knelt beside Peter, gently placing her hand on his shoulder. "Peter, I'll take care of you," she said in a soothing voice, though she could not hide the pain in her heart. The boy looked at her with tearful eyes, then turned his gaze toward the door, where his father had just disappeared. Outside, Alexander got into the car and signaled the driver to leave. Thomas, his right-hand man, was waiting inside and glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Is everything settled, sir?" Thomas asked in a neutral tone. "There's nothing more to discuss," Alexander replied coldly. "It's just a minor matter." Thomas smirked, nodded, and said no more. The car rolled down the snow-covered road, leaving the orphanage behind in silence and frost. Peter remained seated there, his eyes fixed on the door, hoping for a miracle. But the door did not open, and the father he loved did not return. Mrs. Rose sighed, gently lifting him up and taking him inside, where a fireplace burned to provide warmth. "You'll have a home here, Peter. We'll get through this together," she said, though her heart ached for the pain the little boy was enduring. That cold winter day closed with an image of Peter curled up in an old blanket, his eyes gazing out the window. He didn't yet know that this day would mark the biggest turning point in his life. As time passed, the orphanage became the place where Peter had to learn to live and face life. But for him, it never felt like home. The small room, the worn-out bunk bed, and the simple meals couldn't fill the emptiness in his heart. Peter grew up in loneliness, enduring the curious and often mocking stares of the other children daily. "Look, there's the mute boy. He can't even talk," a child named Caleb shouted, laughing with his friends. Their laughter echoed in the small dining room, where Peter sat alone at the corner of the table, trying to avoid their gaze. Peter couldn't respond, nor did he know how to react. He simply lowered his head, gripping his spoon tightly, but his eyes betrayed deep hurt. Even though he couldn't hear their taunts clearly, he could feel the scorn through their behavior and looks. Mrs. Rose walked in, quickly assessing the situation. "Caleb, be quiet. If you keep this up, you'll be cleaning the kitchen tonight," she scolded, her tone stern. Caleb shrugged, trying to hide a mocking grin, then led his group away. Mrs. Rose approached Peter, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, Peter. Don't mind them. You're stronger than you think," she said softly. Peter nodded slightly, his eyes still downcast. He couldn't say thank you, but the warmth in her voice soothed some of the pain in his heart. In his free time, Peter often sought out a quiet corner in the orphanage's yard, where a large tree and an old wooden bench stood. There, he would sit for hours with sheets of paper and some colored pencils that Mrs. Rose had managed to gather from small donations. He loved to draw, as holding a pencil was the only way he felt he could express his emotions and thoughts. One day, Peter drew a large picture of a family standing under the sunlight. It was the image of a dream: a father, a mother, and a boy smiling brightly. But just as he finished, Caleb and his group appeared again. "Look at this. The mute boy is drawing something. Probably just some nonsense." Caleb snatched the drawing from Peter's hands, holding it up for the other kids to see. Laughter erupted, and without hesitation, Caleb tore the drawing in half. Peter lunged forward, trying to retrieve it, but he couldn't. The kids continued destroying the drawing, ripping it into smaller pieces and scattering them on the ground. One of them even dumped a bucket of water on Peter, drenching him and the paper fragments. "Useless," Caleb said, tossing the bucket aside before walking off with his group. Peter sat down on the cold ground, water soaking into his clothes, making him shiver. But he didn't cry. He quietly bent down, picking up the torn pieces of paper, trying to piece them back together. His small hands trembled as he stubbornly attempted to restore the fragments, as if holding on to a part of his shattered dream. From a distance, Mrs. Rose watched the scene. She sighed, clenching her fists to suppress her anger. She knew that rushing over to scold the children now would only make Peter the target of even more ridicule. Instead, she approached him gently and knelt beside him. "Peter, are you okay?" she asked softly. Peter nodded but didn't look up. He continued piecing the torn fragments together, even though it was futile. Mrs. Rose placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, offering silent yet meaningful support. "I'll find a way to protect you better," Mrs. Rose whispered, almost as if making a promise to herself. In the days that followed, Peter spent more time in his room, avoiding the other children. He continued to draw, but he often did so on small scraps of paper that he could hide away. Despite the isolation, he began to develop a quiet resilience, refusing to let their taunts extinguish his passion. One evening, when everyone else was asleep, Peter sat by the small window in his room, the faint moonlight casting a soft glow on his face. He drew another picture, this time of a boy standing alone in a forest, with a distant light shining down a glimmer of hope. Peter never stopped dreaming of the day he could escape this isolation and find a place where he truly belonged. Yet, deep inside, the pain of being abandoned by his father lingered like a wound that refused to heal. The next morning, the children tried to bother Peter again, but this time, Mrs. Rose was prepared. "Caleb, I warned you. Today, you'll be staying behind to clean the entire dining hall," she said firmly. Caleb pouted but didn't dare argue. Mrs. Rose turned to Peter, who sat quietly with his eyes lowered. She crouched down and whispered, "Don't worry, Peter. We'll get through this together." Though Peter's eyes didn't reveal much, Mrs. Rose knew that her words of encouragement were the only lifeline he could hold on to. He gave a small nod, a quiet acceptance. After the other children had left, Mrs. Rose sat down beside Peter. "You know, Peter," she began, "you're more special than you think. One day, you'll show them that you're not useless, and you'll do something no one ever expected." Peter looked at Mrs. Rose, and for a moment, there was a faint glimmer in his eyes, small but unmistakable. He had never thought he could achieve something remarkable, but Mrs. Rose's words planted a seed of hope in his heart, small but powerful. In a luxurious conference room atop a skyscraper in the city center, Alexander sat at the head of the table, his cold gaze sweeping over the employees. He had become a successful businessman, owning a large construction company. Everywhere, people spoke of him with admiration, though not without caution. Alexander was not only known for his ability to make money but also for his ruthless nature, willing to sacrifice anything for personal gain. "I want these numbers to double by the next quarter," Alexander said with authority. "Thomas, do you have a concrete plan?" Thomas, Alexander's right-hand man and closest advisor, sat beside him, a smug smile on his face. "Of course, sir. I've arranged to sign a contract with a new partner, even though they're demanding relatively low profit margins. But don't worry, I have a way to increase the margins by lowering the quality of materials without anyone noticing." Alexander frowned, but not out of concern, rather, because of the cunning strategy Thomas presented. "Are you sure this won't lead to any consequences?" he asked. "Absolutely, sir. If anything goes wrong, I'll take full responsibility," Thomas replied with unnerving confidence. Alexander nodded, unwilling to probe further. For him, profits always came first, and Thomas had long proven himself as someone who could deliver results, no matter the methods. Other employees in the room exchanged worried glances but dared not speak up. They knew Alexander was not a man who could be easily persuaded, let alone one who valued advice contrary to his ambitions. A few months later, the company began facing its first major issues. Buildings Alexander had invested in were found to have structural flaws caused by substandard materials. The media started raising questions, and shareholders grew increasingly concerned. In his private office, Alexander slammed a stack of documents onto his desk, his eyes blazing with anger. "Thomas! Explain this to me," he roared. Thomas entered, trying to maintain his composure. "Sir, this is just a minor issue. I've contacted the crisis management team, and will handle everything before it gets out of control." "Minor issue? Do you realize how much this is damaging the company's reputation? Our stock has dropped 15% this week." Alexander shouted, his voice seething with fury. Thomas smiled, but this time, the smile was strained. "Sir, I assure you, everything will be fine. You trust me, don't you?" Alexander stared at Thomas for a long moment. Deep down, he began to doubt his associate, but his pride wouldn't allow him to admit he might have made a mistake by giving Thomas too much power. Finally, he waved a hand dismissively, signaling Thomas to leave. Meanwhile, in other departments, employees were increasingly worried about the company's direction. Ignacio, a longtime employee, sighed heavily as he sat next to his colleague, Maria. "Do you think the company is heading in the wrong direction?" Ignacio asked, his voice filled with concern. Maria nodded, lowering her voice to avoid being overheard. "Yes, but who would dare say anything? Alexander trusts Thomas completely. If anyone speaks out, they'll lose their job immediately." Ignacio shook his head. "It's such a shame. This company used to be something we were all proud of. But now, everything is falling apart because of the greed of a few." Back in Alexander's office, things were far from as peaceful as the building's exterior suggested. The financial reports grew worse by the day. Alexander incessantly called for emergency meetings, but instead of taking responsibility, he blamed everyone around him. Even his most loyal employees began to feel drained and lost their faith in him. One day, Thomas walked into the office with his usual smug expression, but this time, Alexander couldn't contain his anger. "You said everything would be fine. Now explain to me why we've lost 2 major contracts." Alexander roared. Thomas shrugged, as if it didn't matter. "Sir, I think you need to calm down. My decisions were all for the greater good, but maybe the problem lies in how you're running the company." Alexander froze, unable to believe his ears. It was the first time Thomas had dared to speak like that in front of him. Instead of responding, a wave of intense anger surged through him, and he slammed his fist onto the desk. "Get out," he shouted, his voice shaking with fury. Thomas left, but not before flashing a mocking smile. At that moment, Alexander realized that Thomas was no longer entirely loyal to him. Yet, he couldn't act against him right away, as Thomas held too many secrets and wielded too much power within the company. That evening, Alexander sat alone in his vast office, the light from the chandelier reflecting off the failed financial reports spread across the desk. He grabbed a glass of strong liquor and drank it down in frustration. The pressure weighed heavily on him, but instead of reflecting deeply, he felt only anger and helplessness. From his window, he gazed out at the brightly lit city, a symbol of his success. But now, Alexander felt everything slipping through his fingers. His pride wouldn't allow him to admit fault. He convinced himself that this was only temporary, that he would find a way to turn things around. Yet deep inside, for the first time, Alexander felt real fear. It wasn't just the fear of losing the company, it was the fear of losing everything he had built and the reputation he had so carefully guarded. The image of Alexander sitting motionless in his office, his bloodshot eyes reflecting his inner collapse, showed the downfall of a man blinded by ambition. But he still didn't realize that Thomas wasn't the only problem. The root of his failure lay in his own arrogance and greed. Late at night, the lights in Alexander's mansion still shone brightly in the quiet suburbs. He stepped through the heavy iron gates, his footsteps echoing on the cold stone path. Inside the lavish mansion, silence reigned, broken only by the whistling wind through the window cracks. Clara, the housekeeper, bowed as he entered but quickly withdrew upon seeing his tense expression. Alexander shrugged off his coat, carelessly tossing it onto a chair. This mansion, once filled with the laughter of family, was now an empty shell, housing memories he had long tried to bury. He walked into the storage room, a place where relics of the past were kept, but he hadn't dared open the door for years. The old wooden door creaked as he pushed it open. The smell of decaying wood and time flooded the room, causing Alexander to wrinkle his nose. In the dimly lit space, old photographs, small toys, and a box of his late wife Helen's belongings sat untouched on the shelves. He picked up a family photograph. Alexander stood in the center, one hand on Helen's shoulder, the other holding Peter when he was just a little boy. Peter's eyes in the photo sparkled with innocence and happiness, a feeling Alexander could no longer recall. He held the photo, feeling as though it weighed 1,000 pounds. Memories of Helen washed over him, tightening his chest. Helen had passed away years ago due to illness, leaving a void Alexander had never tried to fill. He set the photo down, his gaze darkening. Peter, Alexander muttered, his son's name escaping like a curse. The memories of his decision to abandon Peter came rushing back, vivid as if it were yesterday. He remembered the boy's tear-filled eyes, the way Peter clung to his coat, silently pleading with a desperation Alexander had ignored. "It was you were the cause," Alexander growled, as if speaking to a ghost. He angrily kicked a chair, sending it crashing to the floor. His fury erupted uncontrollably. Alexander began tearing through the room, photos ripped from their frames, mementos hurled to the ground, shattered into pieces. Clara heard the commotion and hurried upstairs, alarmed. "Mr. Alexander. Are you all right?" she called out, standing outside the door. "Get out!" Alexander screamed, his voice echoing through the halls. Startled, Clara stepped back, too afraid to enter. She lingered outside, worried but powerless to intervene. Alexander turned around, his bloodshot eyes scanning the destruction he had just caused. He was breathing heavily, but his anger didn't subside. He grabbed another photograph, one where Helen was smiling while holding Peter, and tore it in half. "Because of you, it's all your fault," he shouted, slamming his fist onto the table, as if the echo could soothe the pain gnawing at him. But then, silence fell over the room once more. Alexander sank to the floor, his entire body trembling. For the first time in years, he felt utterly alone. No one remained to share his burdens, no family, no wife who had once been his greatest support. All that was left was an unfillable void and the quiet, relentless regret festering inside him. Clara, after waiting outside for a while, decided to open the door slightly. She saw Alexander sitting amid the wreckage, his head bowed, clutching the torn family photograph. His eyes were empty, a stark contrast to the powerful man she had always known. Gently, she stepped inside and began picking up some of the scattered pieces of the photograph from the floor. "Mr. Alexander, perhaps you should rest," Clara said softly, her voice tinged with concern. Alexander didn't reply. He merely looked up at Clara with weary eyes. "You don't understand, Clara. I've lost everything. Everything." Clara knelt down, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's never too late to make things right, sir. But you have to start somewhere." Alexander stared at her, as if her words were an impossible dream. Make things right? How could he possibly mend a shattered past? He had abandoned his son, an unforgivable act. Now, all that remained was emptiness and a lifetime of wrong decisions. After Clara left, Alexander stayed there in the darkness. The light from outside filtered through the window, casting faint streaks across the floor. He picked up the torn photograph, trying to piece the two halves back together. But no matter how hard he tried, the tear remained a constant reminder that nothing could ever be the same. He lay back on the floor, staring up at the ceiling. Images of Peter, his tear-filled eyes, and Helen, her gentle smile, flooded his mind. Alexander felt as though he were sinking into an endless black hole, devoid of light and escape. Cold wind whistled through the cracks in the window, brushing over him, but Alexander didn't care. He closed his eyes, listening to the sound of silence that enveloped the mansion. It wasn't just the quiet of the night, it was the deathly stillness of a life devoid of love and forgiveness. The grand mansion, once a symbol of his success and power, was now nothing more than an empty shell, haunted by ghosts of the past and memories he couldn't escape. Alexander remained on the floor, his vacant eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if waiting for something or someone to pull him out of the abyss of loneliness. But nothing came. Only he remained, alone with his pain and indescribable regret. Peter grew up in the orphanage, where loneliness and discrimination became a part of his life. But over time, he learned to face reality. Unlike the other children, Peter neither complained nor fought back. He quietly endured, hiding his pain within and creating a private world through his drawings. One autumn morning, soft sunlight streamed into the common room, where the children gathered to play. Now a teenager, Peter sat alone in a corner with a worn piece of cloth spread out before him. Holding a set of frayed crayons, he carefully drew each line. He often sketched images that evoked hope, smiling faces and sunny skies, as if trying to fill the emptiness in his heart. "Look at the mute boy drawing again." Caleb's voice rang out from across the room. He was older now, but his malice hadn't faded. The other children laughed, pointing at Peter. Peter didn't react, continuing to draw. But as Caleb and two of his friends approached, he knew his peace wouldn't last. Caleb bent down and picked up one of Peter's crayons. "You don't need this many, do you?" he sneered, snapping the crayon in half before tossing it to the floor. The other children laughed loudly. Peter stopped drawing, his eyes fixed on Caleb. But instead of showing anger or tears, he bent down, picked up the broken crayon, set it aside, and resumed drawing with another one. The act annoyed Caleb. "You think you're so special? Let's see what you can do with this trash." He grabbed Peter's cloth and knocked over his box of crayons. Peter lunged to save his drawing, but Caleb flung it aside. One of the other kids poured a cup of water over the cloth, smearing all the colors. Peter stood there, watching his work dissolve, his eyes filled with pain but refusing to shed a single tear. At that moment, a deep voice rang out from the doorway. "Stop it right now, kids." Richard, the elderly man in charge of the orphanage's supply room, entered. His stern gaze swept across the children. Caleb and his group froze, awkwardly glancing at each other before scurrying away. Richard approached Peter, taking in the sight of the soaked cloth and scattered crayons on the floor. "Are you all right, Peter?" he asked, bending down to pick up the scattered items. Peter didn't respond, only giving a faint nod. He crouched down to gather the remaining pieces, his hands trembling. Richard sighed and placed a hand on Peter's shoulder. "You're special, Peter. Not everyone can express their soul through art like you can. Don't let those who don't understand discourage you." Peter looked at him, a faint yet profound glimmer of light in his eyes. Richard smiled, then stood up. "Wait here for a moment," he said before leaving the room. A few minutes later, Richard returned with a small box in his hands. "I think you might need this," he said, handing the box to Peter. When Peter opened it, he found brushes, colored pencils, and a fresh pad of drawing paper inside. The tools were simple but the most precious gift he had ever received. Peter held the box, his hands shaking with emotion. He bowed his head as if to say thank you, but no words came out. Instead, he opened the drawing pad and began sketching right there, creating a new piece of art with resolute strokes. Richard sat beside him, silently watching. After a while, he said, "My son used to be an artist. He started just like you, with small drawings full of hope. Keep drawing, Peter. I believe you can achieve great things." In the days that followed, Peter spent most of his time in his little corner drawing. From small sketches on paper, he moved on to larger canvases that Richard managed to find. Every stroke of his brush was filled with intense emotion, not just pain but also resilience and a belief in a brighter future. One day, a woman named Caroline, an art teacher from the city, visited the orphanage. She was searching for young talent to support in a community project. When she saw Peter's paintings, she couldn't hide her astonishment. "These paintings are incredible. Who made them?" Caroline asked, her eyes scanning the room. Richard pointed toward Peter, who was quietly drawing in the corner. "That boy. But he's very shy." Caroline walked over and sat down next to Peter. "You're a real artist," she said gently. "I've never seen anyone express such deep emotions through colors." Peter looked up at Caroline, his eyes filled with surprise. He had never imagined receiving praise from a stranger. But his gaze also revealed uncertainty. The scars of his past made it hard for him to trust in anything good. Caroline noticed this. "I want to help you develop your talent. But first, you need to believe that you deserve it," she said sincerely. Peter didn't reply. He simply lowered his head, his hands gripping his pencil tightly. Inside him was a mix of emotions, hope mingled with fear. But the look in Caroline's and Richard's eyes seemed like a promise that he wasn't alone on this journey. The image of Peter standing before a large canvas, his eyes brimming with pain and determination, marked a turning point in his life. He no longer painted just to escape reality but to express the strength within him. In the executive office on the top floor of the company headquarters, Alexander stood motionless in front of the window, gazing at the busy traffic below. Beneath him was the city he had once ruled, but now it felt as though everything was turning against him. Negative news about the company dominated the media, key partners withdrew, and the company's stock was plummeting uncontrollably. A knock on the door startled Alexander. "Come in," he said, his voice heavy. Thomas entered, holding a stack of documents. Unlike his usual confident demeanor, his face now showed clear signs of worry. "Sir, I'm afraid the situation isn't looking good," he said, placing the folder on the desk. Alexander glanced at the financial report, the pages filled with red ink indicating severe losses. "What is this, Thomas? You told me things would stabilize. Is this how you're handling it?" Alexander growled, his voice sharp and icy. Thomas tried to remain composed. "Sir, I've done everything within my power. But the shareholders have lost confidence, and the issue with the substandard materials hasn't died down. I warned you before that we needed a strategy to protect the company's image." Alexander slammed the folder onto the desk, cutting him off. "Don't talk as if you had nothing to do with this. You're the one who made these decisions. Don't you dare pin this on me." He stood up, slamming his hands onto the desk, his eyes blazing with anger. Thomas smirked, for the first time dropping any pretense of respect. His gaze carried an unmistakable defiance. "Have you forgotten that you approved every single plan? I was merely following orders. If you want to find someone to blame, perhaps you should start with yourself." Those words hit Alexander's pride like a direct punch. He lunged toward Thomas but stopped short. A sense of helplessness overtook him. For the first time in his life, Alexander realized his power was no longer enough to dominate others. "Get out," he roared, his voice echoing throughout the office. Thomas merely shrugged and left the room without another word. When the door closed, Alexander collapsed into his chair, burying his head in his hands. He had no one left to trust, no one to rely on. Thomas, the man he had once depended on, was now just a betrayer waiting for the right moment to exploit him. A week later, Alexander's company was officially exposed by the media for its misconduct. Detailed articles about the use of substandard materials in major projects sparked public outrage. The shareholders held emergency meetings, demanding an explanation from him. But Alexander, in his pride, refused to attend. At a press conference held just outside the company's headquarters, an elderly shareholder named Matthew addressed the crowd of reporters. "Alexander has led this company down the worst possible path. We can no longer place our trust in him. It's time for new leadership." Sitting in his office, Alexander watched the events unfold on screen. He clenched his teeth, his bloodshot eyes filled with rage. He felt as though the whole world was against him. But deep down, he knew the truth: no one was to blame but himself. His ambitious decisions, blind trust in Thomas, and unchecked arrogance had brought him to this point. The next day, Alexander received a notification from the board of directors. He was officially removed from his position as CEO and forced to step down. It was a devastating blow to a man who had once stood at the pinnacle of power. Clara, his longtime housekeeper, saw him return home looking haggard. "Mr. Alexander, I've prepared some tea," she said softly, her voice filled with concern. Alexander didn't reply and silently climbed the stairs to his familiar study. The once grand mansion no longer offered the warmth or authority it once had. Everything around him felt like lifeless objects, reflecting his isolation. In the study, Alexander noticed the family photos that Clara had carefully restored after he had destroyed them. The pieces had been patched together, but the tears were still visible, much like his own life at that moment. He closed his eyes, and memories from the past flooded in. Peter, Helen, the days when he had everything yet he hadn't appreciated it. Now, Helen was gone forever, and Peter, his son, had likely forgotten he even existed. One morning, Alexander received unexpected news: Thomas had fled, taking a large sum of money from the company's accounts. This marked the definitive end of Sunrise Construction, the company Alexander had spent his life building. Loyal employees filed their resignations, projects were cancelled, and the once bustling headquarters now stood empty. Alexander stood outside the building, watching as the company's logo was removed. A wave of loss washed over him. The people who once bowed to him now avoided even glancing his way. He felt like a ghost, wandering among the skyscrapers that had once been his pride. A cold wind swept through, blowing his scarf into the street. Alexander didn't bother picking it up. He stood still, staring into the distance. He realized he had lost everything: his company, his family, and his honor. As the sun set, Alexander walked away. But this time, he didn't return to the mansion. Instead, he drove to a secluded suburban area where he had lived in his youth, before becoming a businessman. Parking by the roadside, he stepped out and stood in the middle of an empty field. The last light of the day illuminated his face, revealing the exhaustion and deep loneliness etched into his eyes. Alexander stood there for a long time, as though waiting for salvation, but nothing came. Only he remained, alone with the choices that had destroyed everything he once had. The next day, Alexander entered the shareholders' meeting room, a place that had once been his domain. The vast, gleaming space, lit by a grand chandelier, now felt stifling. The gazes directed at him no longer carried respect but instead were cold and scrutinizing. News had spread that Sunrise Construction was being acquired by a mysterious young entrepreneur, and Alexander had been summoned to discuss the new direction. Adjusting his tie, Alexander tried to maintain his composure, though his insides burned with anxiety. Thomas stood nearby, wearing his usual smug smile, but this time, even his confidence couldn't ease Alexander's unease. "Is everyone present?" Alexander barked, his sharp eyes scanning the room. One of the shareholders, Enrique, responded, "Yes, everyone is here. But we're waiting for the new chairman, who will now lead the company." Alexander narrowed his eyes. "A new chairman? Who dares to stand against me?" The large doors swung open, and all eyes turned to the person walking in. A young man, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, tall and confident, strode into the room with deliberate steps. His neatly combed dark hair and steady gaze commanded the attention of everyone present, freezing the atmosphere in place. Alexander's heart pounded as he recognized the familiar face. "Peter," he muttered, disbelief evident in his voice. Peter, the son Alexander had abandoned years ago, now stood before him with a presence entirely transformed. He looked directly at Alexander, his gaze unwavering and fearless. "Ladies and gentlemen, I am Peter Martin, the new chairman of Sunrise Construction," Peter announced, his voice clear and precise, every word piercing Alexander's pride like a dagger. "Today, I am here not only to take over this company but also to restore the values it has lost." Alexander stammered, how?" Peter cut him off. "You don't need to know. I am here to make one important announcement, Alexander, you are officially terminated from Sunrise Construction. Effective immediately." The room fell into an icy silence. Alexander's face turned pale, his lips quivering as he struggled to find words. "You can't do this. This is my company," he bellowed, his voice breaking under the weight of his rage. Peter stepped closer, his eyes blazing with anger but also carrying a deep, unspoken pain. "This company is not yours. It belongs to the hard-working people who built it. You turned it into a tool for your greed and selfishness. I am simply restoring it to its rightful place." Alexander felt as if the ground beneath him had crumbled. The other shareholders remained silent, but their expressions clearly sided with Peter. Not a single person rose to defend Alexander. "Peter, listen to me," Alexander began, but the word "son" slipped out, making Peter's anger flare even more. "Don't call me that," Peter said coldly. "You abandoned me from the very start. Don't pretend we have any sort of relationship." Alexander stepped back as though struck by an invisible blow. The image of the small boy he had left behind, reaching out to him in desperation, now resurfaced in the eyes of the man standing before him. The meeting ended with Peter's declaration, but Alexander could no longer bear to stay. He left the room, his steps heavy as though carrying the weight of a collapsed world. Behind him, Peter stood still, his gaze filled with disappointment and something else, something harder to name. The last thing Alexander saw was his reflection in the large hallway mirror, an old, weary man, overthrown by the very son he had once cast aside. He could hardly believe fate had brought him to this point. Alexander sat in his now empty office, a place that had once symbolized his power and authority. On his desk, a mess of disorganized files lay scattered, their pages filled with red numbers signaling failure. Among them sat the official notice from Peter, its short but sharp wording cutting into Alexander's pride. "Alexander Martin, you must publicly apologize to all employees for the mistakes you have made." Never in his life had Alexander felt such humiliation. He had once been a prominent businessman, revered by all who crossed his path. Now, he was being forced to humble himself before the very people he had once looked down on. Yet Peter had made it clear, refusal would result in all his personal assets tied to the company being frozen immediately. The room was silent, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Clara, his faithful housekeeper, entered quietly with a cup of hot tea. "Mr. Alexander, you should rest for a bit. Things will get better," she said, her voice filled with worry. Alexander didn't respond. He simply stared out the window, where the morning light bathed the city, though everything in his mind remained shrouded in gray. "Clara," he said hoarsely, "do you think I'm a terrible man?" Clara paused, then answered, "I don't think you're terrible, sir. But you've made many mistakes. And perhaps now is the time to make amends." Alexander picked up the teacup, his hands trembling. He didn't reply, only giving a slight nod. The following day, Alexander entered the company's large conference hall, where hundreds of employees had gathered. Every gaze turned toward him, but none carried the respect he had once commanded. Instead, those eyes held disappointment, anger, and disdain. Peter stood at the central podium, his tall frame and confident demeanor making him stand out from the crowd. As Alexander walked toward the podium, the murmurs in the room fell silent. Peter looked at him, his gaze devoid of pity. "Do you have anything to say to your employees, Alexander?" Peter asked, his voice cold. Alexander stepped up to the podium, his hand gripping the microphone tightly. He looked out at the crowd, feeling as though his legs would give out beneath him. He began, his voice faltering. "I want to apologize." The room fell into a tense silence. A few employees exchanged surprised glances, unable to believe they were hearing these words from Alexander. "I made grave mistakes," Alexander continued, his voice heavy with regret. "I let greed and arrogance cloud my judgment. I didn't just harm this company, I hurt the people who once trusted me. I am deeply sorry for everything." No one clapped. No one spoke. But the silence itself was deafening, and it weighed heavier on Alexander than any jeers or accusations could. For the first time, he truly felt the magnitude of his failure. Right after the meeting, Peter summoned Thomas into the main office. Alexander stood outside, observing through the slightly open door. Thomas stepped in, still wearing his smug smile, but this time, Peter's piercing gaze unsettled him, wiping away his composure. "Thomas," Peter said, his voice sharp as a knife. "You've abused your power, tarnished this company's reputation, and left behind an unforgivable mess. You are immediately terminated." Thomas's mouth fell open, disbelief written all over his face. "Mr. Peter, you can't do this. I've served this company for years. And caused immeasurable damage," Peter cut him off. "I don't need to hear your excuses. Leave now before I call security." Thomas stood frozen, his face pale. Stumbling, he turned and left the office, his eyes brimming with resentment as they swept past Alexander. But he couldn't meet Alexander's gaze. Thomas stormed out, leaving Alexander and Peter to confront each other in a tense silence. Peter looked at him, his tone softer but still cold. "You should go. This is no longer your place." Alexander bowed his head and walked out of the office. In that moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness envelop him. No power, no position, no one to rely on. A few days later, Alexander moved out of the luxurious mansion in the city center. He relocated to a small house in the suburbs, where no one knew who he was. Clara, though willing to stay and care for him, was turned away by Alexander. "You should live for yourself. Don't waste your time on someone like me," he told her. The small house was modest, devoid of modern comforts, but for Alexander, it was all he deserved. He began to take on small tasks himself, from cleaning to cooking. Every day, he spent time sitting on an old wooden chair on the porch, gazing out at the sprawling fields in front of him. The solitary life gave Alexander plenty of time to reflect. Images from the past came flooding back: Helen, the wife he loved but never cherished enough; Peter, the son he had cruelly cast aside; and himself, a man whose ambition had clouded his judgment. One evening, Alexander sat on the porch, watching the sunset. A deep sense of regret welled up inside him. He knew it was too late for many things, but even so, he couldn't stop blaming himself. Silent tears streaked down his weathered face as, for the first time in years, Alexander allowed himself to feel the pain. The image of Alexander alone, his aging face etched with exhaustion and remorse, closed the scene. Within him, a question echoed endlessly: was there any chance to redeem what had been lost? A year passed since Alexander left the company and embarked on his solitary life in the suburbs. Each day began with him watering the plants in his small backyard and ended with hours spent quietly sitting on the wooden chair, watching the sun set behind the distant fields. Life was simple, but with every passing day, he felt the unfillable void within himself grow clearer. One autumn morning, as soft sunlight streamed through the window, Alexander sat at the table drinking tea when Clara, his former housekeeper, came to visit. She brought a small package, neatly tied with a pale blue ribbon. "Mr. Alexander, I received this at the post office today." "They said it came from the city," Clara said, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. Alexander took the package, his heartbeat quickening as he recognized the handwriting on it. It was Peter's. With trembling hands, he opened it, revealing a letter and a photograph inside. The photograph was a stunning piece of art. In it, a young boy stood in the middle of a forest, soft light streaming down on his face from a distance, creating a scene filled with hope. Beneath the photo, there was a single word, hope. Alexander set the photo down and picked up the letter to read. The letter was not long, but each word pierced deeply into his heart. "Father. Over the past year, I've thought a lot. Perhaps we can't change the past, but I believe everyone deserves a second chance. This is one of my works, and it represents how I feel now. I don't blame you, nor do I hate you. I only hope that you find peace and the true meaning of life. Peter." Alexander bowed his head onto the table, unable to hold back his tears. He wept, for the first time in his life, out of deep repentance. Peter didn't blame him, didn't hold anger, but instead extended a forgiveness Alexander had not dared to hope for. Clara, standing beside him, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sir, Peter truly is a remarkable son. You should be proud of him." Alexander looked up, his tear-streaked face filled with sorrow. "What have I done to deserve this forgiveness? I abandoned him, denied his existence, and now he's reaching out to me." Clara smiled gently and said, "Forgiveness isn't about whether someone deserves it. It's about doing what's right. Perhaps this is your chance to do something meaningful." In the days that followed, Alexander spent more time reflecting on the words in the letter. He began doing small acts that brought great meaning to his life. He contacted a nearby church and offered to help the homeless. At first, those around him were surprised to see an elderly, quiet man volunteering. But Alexander paid no attention to their glances, he focused solely on the work. One evening, after distributing soup to the homeless, Alexander sat down to chat with a boy named Luke, about 9 years old, sitting in the corner of the dining hall. The boy had bright eyes and a shy smile that reminded Alexander of Peter as a child. "Where do you live, Luke?" Alexander asked gently. Luke lowered his head and softly replied, "I don't have a home. My mom passed away last year. I lived with my grandmother, but she's very sick, so I come here to find food." Alexander felt his heart tighten. He placed a hand on Luke's shoulder. "Don't worry, you'll be okay. I'll do my best to help you and your grandmother." Luke looked up at him, hope shining in his eyes. "Really? Thank you, sir." The image of Luke stayed with Alexander, reminding him of Peter. In that moment, he realized that helping others was not just a way to atone for his mistakes but also a path to rediscover himself. A few months later, Alexander received a phone call from Peter. For the first time in years, Peter's voice came through on the other end. "Dad," Peter said, his voice gentle but filled with emotion. "I heard you've started doing charity work." Alexander gripped the phone tightly, his hands trembling. "Yes, I've started. I don't know if it's enough to make up for my mistakes, but I'm trying." "You don't need to atone," Peter replied. "What I want is for you to live well and find meaning in life. If you've done that, then I'm happy." Alexander was silent for a long time, struggling to compose himself. "Peter, can you forgive me?" Peter replied softly, "I forgave you a long time ago, Dad." Those words lifted a massive weight off Alexander's shoulders. He couldn't hold back his tears, but this time, they weren't tears of pain or regret, they were tears of happiness and gratitude. Finally, Alexander decided to meet Peter again. At a small cafe in the city center, father and son sat across from each other. Peter smiled, his eyes full of love. Alexander looked at him, feeling prouder and happier than ever. "I once thought I had lost everything," Alexander said in a warm, low voice. "But today, I realized that the most important thing I never truly lost was you." Peter smiled and took his hand. "We still have time to make things right, Dad." The image of Alexander and Peter sitting together, smiles on their faces, closed a new chapter in Alexander's life. He understood that even though he had lost so much, he had found the most precious thing: love and hope. Hope was not just a word but a reminder that everything can begin again. The story of Alexander and Peter teaches us that it is never too late to right our wrongs. Forgiveness not only brings peace to the forgiven but also frees the forgiver from unnecessary suffering. Love and family are the most important things, far beyond ambition or material success. Through loss and regret, Alexander came to understand the value of sincerity, compassion, and hope. Life always gives us a chance to start over, as long as we are brave enough to face the past.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.